Okay, so before we get started with today's ancient DOS game, Zoop, I need to point out something archaic, which serves as proof that this game's publisher had no idea what they were doing. When you start up this game, it brings up this licensing rights screen. Now, this kind of screen is nothing out of the ordinary. If you're watching a movie or television show from a VHS tape or DVD, those kinds of things were intended for private home viewing. But remember, this is a video game. This screen right here is basically prohibiting people from playing this game in a public setting or even showcasing any screenshots, gameplay footage, sound, music, so yeah, if it wasn't for fair use or fair dealing clauses and copyright law, this video you're watching right now would be illegal. Anyways, Zoop. I know I said I was going to be covering a strategy game, but I found out my copy was only for Windows, not for DOS, so I decided to cover this game instead, as this is going to be the next game anyways. Zoop is basically an action puzzle game with a sort of minimalist graphical approach. My guess is they were trying to compete with games such as Tetris or Columns, but although the game is pretty unique in its own right in terms of how the mechanics work, there's a number of reasons why this game flopped pretty hard, despite the numerous platforms it was released on, and the ridiculous licensing terms trying to prevent people from showcasing this thing certainly didn't help. Now, don't get me wrong, the game actually controls and plays perfectly fine, but the main issues come down to how much you actually get for a full-priced game, when the game came out, and just adapting to the mechanics in the first place. If this game came out in the late 80s or early 90s, it would have done significantly better. But it came out in the mid-90s, a time when puzzle games weren't doing so well, as 3D graphics were all the rage, with some companies like Sony even going so far as to adopt policies preventing the licensing of 2D games for their consoles. The irony being that Zoop squeezed in very quickly after the PlayStation's North American launch, so this game somehow managed to dodge getting hit by that policy. Timing is everything when it comes to intentionally trying to release a hit product. Too early and no one will get it. Too late and everyone will have moved on to other things. Zoop is very much in the too late category in that regard, and unless you really enjoy the gameplay in this thing, you're barely going to play it for more than maybe 10 or 20 minutes before you never touch it again. Zoop was the first of only 2 games ever made by Hookstone Productions, and was published through Viacom New Media in 1995. What's weird about this is that Viacom pretty much exclusively published licensed titles based on television shows they had a vested interest in, such as the Beavis and Butt-Head franchise. So there must have been something special going on between Hookstone and Viacom, but I couldn't figure it out. It's a one-player action/puzzle game with support for a huge array of audio devices due to it using third-party audio drivers, but amazingly, despite how simple the graphics are, despite the fact that they managed to get this working on a freaking Game Boy with a 160 by 144 screen and only 4 shades of gray, this DOS release only supports 640 by 480 256 color SVGA graphics. Why limit your market like that? Even the README file for this game admits to there being a multitude of potential hardware issues with trying to run the game due to poor VESA implementations, so why not have a VGA alternative that's simply lacking all the anti-aliasing and glow effects? So that way virtually everyone who bought a copy would be able to at least play it? Ugh. Anywho, as for its current release state, it's still commercial, but as you might imagine, due to the extreme amount of marketing combined with being ported to numerous systems, and in combination with no one giving a toss about this thing anymore, finding loose copies is super easy and dirt cheap, provided you don't care what system you're getting it for. SNES and Genesis carts are the most common and tend to go for just a few bucks loose, or around $25 to $30 brand new and sealed. DOS copies are considerably more difficult to find, but they're only a few dollars more expensive, both loose and boxed. The only exception to all of this is the Atari Jaguar release, which was extremely limited and thus super rare, with copies for that system being nearly double the price of the DOS version. And just to drive the point home that Viacom didn't quite know what they were doing with publishing this thing, the DOS version actually has a system requirement of Windows 3.1 or 3.11, yet it installs perfectly fine without Windows, and there is in fact no Windows executables on the disk. So yeah, no idea who dropped the ball on that one, but it's another example of how this game seems to not want people to play it. So let's talk gameplay. As with other action puzzle games of the time, you have a couple modes to choose from, a continual mode and a level mode. They keep different high score tables, and the only difference between them is that level mode resets the board between stages, whereas continual mode does not. When you choose your game mode, you're next able to set your starting stage from 1 to 9 and your difficulty from 0 to 4. This might be a little confusing at first, but essentially the stage primarily affects how fast everything goes, and the difficulty affects how many extra pieces are generated on the board, either initially for the continual mode, or for every stage in the level mode. The gameplay itself is actually pretty suitable for this genre, and unique enough not to blend in with other action puzzle games. You control a triangular craft in a 4x4 box in the middle of the screen, and on all 4 sides of this box are rows and columns of pieces which will head towards the center. Now if any pieces reach the center, your craft is destroyed and the game ends. So to stop a piece, you have to zoop it, essentially ramming it at high speed with your craft with the fire button. And something I find amusing is that the instructions constantly refer to this as a zoop, but every single time it says this, it has in brackets, fire. Just to remind people that yes, you use a fire button because you're firing yourself into these things, but they wanted to be cool and edgy and use the word zoop instead, which isn't at all confusing and should totally be the new way you say the word fire. Yeah. But basically, the puzzle aspect comes into play in terms of what you hit. When your craft runs into a piece of the same color, it passes straight through the piece, destroying it and giving you points in the process. If, however, your craft runs into a differently colored piece, it swaps the colors. So if your craft is blue and you hit a red piece, the piece will become blue and your craft will become red. It's a very simple mechanic, and it's the core of the gameplay, figuring out how to optimize your gameplay so that every time you zoop yourself, you're clearing as many pieces in one shot as possible. In fact, this is how you earn bonus points, is by zooping multiple pieces at once, and if you clear a filled row or column, you get an even bigger bonus on top of the usual scoring. And so there's a risk-reward factor going on too, but only so far as points are concerned. So if all you want to do is get as far as possible, you shouldn't worry about this, and just try to keep the board clear. To help keep the board clear, power-ups will also show up. There's 4 different kinds: springs, splotches, stars, and lightning bolts. But going in reverse order, the lightning bolt destroys a 3x3 section of pieces when it strikes them, the star eliminates an entire row or column, picking up whatever color or power-up was the last to be hit, splotches remove an entire color from one section of the field when you shoot that color, and springs are interesting. Unlike the other power-ups that you fire into the path of the oncoming pieces, springs are collectible. The instant you collect your 5th spring, all the action stops and every piece on the playfield is cleared away. This is not a good power-up, or rather, it wasn't executed very well for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's no extra lives in this game. As soon as the pieces reach the center, it's game over, so it would have made more sense for the springs to act as extra lives, rather than as something which activates immediately upon collecting 5 of them. You could still have it, so you'd need 5 to activate the effect, but having it activate automatically upon death, or manually by a second button, would have been way more interesting and allowed for longer gameplay sessions. However, the other reason this power-up wasn't done well is because power-ups are mixed in with the other pieces, which are always advancing towards the middle. Saving up your springs for when you need them most is unreliable because you may start a stage and immediately have a column or row produce a spring, and then start advancing it towards you. Sooner or later, you're going to have to shoot that column or row to cut it down so that it doesn't breach the center, and if that triggers a 5th spring collect when you really didn't need it, then it's wasting all the springs you collected up to that point. Again, automatic on death or manually controlled would have made the springs many times better. Actually, I know I don't normally talk about the graphics to any major extent in these videos, since I believe most games handle the graphics well enough for what was intended, but Zoop is an interesting case where the graphics are not only difficult to look at despite the minimalist approach, but were actually designed to be hard to look at. The marketing for the game referred to this as a, quote, opt-to-challenge feature, where the game gets more visually distracting and more difficult to look at the further in you get. That really doesn't sound like an appealing selling point. You're basically saying, this game gets hard to look at. It's more challenging that way, so buy it for the challenge. I swear, the deeper I dig, the more this game just does not want anyone to play it. Okay, this has mostly been a negative episode, even though the game is perfectly fine to play, so let's focus on one thing they actually did do right. The way pieces are generated is not completely random. Now, if this were any other game, that would actually be a drawback, but because this game is very fast-paced in the later levels and effectively requires zooping long color sequences to survive, it would actually become quantifiably impossible to survive past a certain point if the pieces were 100% random. Let me demonstrate what I mean. I started 4 new games in a row and just let the game run without any input until the pieces reached the center, and these were the final layouts I ended up with. Something you'll notice is that there's quite a few long color runs that could be zooped in a single shot. Now, let me show you a quick and dirty basic program I whipped up to do the exact same thing, but with a 100% random chance on which pieces would advance into which rows and columns. Notice that color runs almost never exceed 3 in a row, save for just once? With pure random chance, the odds of having 2 of the same color in sequence is 1 in 4. The odds of having 3 in sequence are 1 in 16. 4 in sequence are 1 in 64. Yeah, that line of 4 right there, that should only happen once out of every 64 sets of 4 pieces generated. The odds of 5 in sequence should be 1 in 256, and yet in 4 runs of the actual game without user input, there was a run of 5 colors 6 times. The game is clearly doing something in the background where when it decides where to put a new piece, it'll actually have a significantly higher chance of matching whatever color is already in place. And as for when it happens with 8 pieces in a row, which I've seen multiple times, you don't know what those odds would be if it was perfectly random? 1 in 16,384. So yeah, not completely random confirmed, but as I said, that's for the better given how this game plays, and I'm glad the devs at least got that right. Zoop's not a bad game by any means, but it seems intentionally designed and marketed to be difficult to enjoy, much less play, despite the minimalist approach and the simple controls. Plus, because of the nature of this game, there's one unforgivable omission that immediately makes this game considerably less desirable compared to most other action puzzle games of the time. There's no 2-player mode. It was affirmed pretty early on that for an action puzzle game to really do well, it absolutely needed to have competitive multiplayer, because that's ultimately what would keep people coming back to it and talking about it. But it's missing in almost every version of this game released, save for the Game Boy version. But the Game Boy version is lacking everything else that made Zoop stand out in terms of visuals due to the reduced resolution and 4 shades of gray. What we're left with is a game that plays perfectly fine, but beyond the marketing, did not hold anyone's attention at all. And thus, once the hype was gone, the game was rapidly forgotten about and few people remember it, let alone even talk about it. And the used game market is flooded with dirt cheap copies. A little more effort and this game could have been up there with the likes of Tetris, Columns, Puyo Puyo, Dr. Mario, Yoshi's Cookie, Panel de Pon, just to name the ones I'm familiar with and enjoy in one form or another. Although you can just leave cycles set to auto without any issues, the game's sound and music are not balanced very well, and there's no in-game controls to adjust the volume levels, and it overrides the hardware mixer settings when you run this thing. So I recommend when setting this up to use Sound Blaster sound that you disable the SB mixer setting so that the game is unable to mess with your own volume settings when you run DOSBox's mixer command. I recommend setting the SB level to 75 to get it more in line with the music if you're going with OPL synth. For anything else, you just have to tinker with the mixer command to get the volume levels balanced in a way that works best for you. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 242 will be on Saturday, July 14th, and we're going to be taking a look at a racing game which not only focuses on clearing stunts, but is also known by 2 different names. And no, that could almost be Stunts 4D Driving itself, but I already covered that as the very first episode of ADG, so you only need to guess one of the names to make the credits, so be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and make sure to stay tuned because there's actually going to be an unboxing for this one too. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.